Good evening, everyone. How are y'all doing? Good. I'm so excited to have Clint Smith here with me. This is a new program we're doing called Next Up to the Mic, and Clint is our second host or second guest for this series. And I was really looking forward to this. As many of you know, Clint is a teacher, a poet, a staff writer for The Atlantic. He's written several books, two poetry. One is called Counting Descent, which came out in 2016, and the other one's called Above Ground, which came out 2023, which he'll be doing a little bit of reading from. And of course, the book that we've all been talking about and made the biggest buzz around, made the New York Times bestseller, won every award there is, How the Word is Passed. I'd like to welcome you to Next Up to the Mic.
Thank you so much for having me.
In the book, Clint, you talk about how our history, how we tell our history as a nation, as a society, and it's not always about what we tell, it's what we leave out. So can you speak a little bit about the origin of the book and what prompted you to start writing it?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, all of you, for coming out. And it's always, so much of my origin story as a writer is we were talking about it before, is tied up in Busboys. When I moved here as a teacher in Prince George's County, Maryland, I lived in DC but commuted out to Prince George's County, and I lived not far from the 14th and V. And I remember going on Friday nights to the 11th Hour Poetry Slam, and it was among the first places that I encountered, I think, the possibilities of what literature could be, and how literature could be something far more expansive, far more robust, far more dynamic than I think I had fully understood it to be. And so I'm forever grateful for the sort of ecosystem that Busboys has created, because there aren't many places in the country where you can go to a poetry reading every night of the week, basically. And that is in part because of the ecosystem of Busboys and all of the other remarkable sort of open mic that sort of ornament the city, that make it a really special place that has a foundation of poetry, a foundation of literature that exists in the veins of the city that is not common in many cities across the country. So yeah, I'm very happy to be back here.
I think DC is now actually the #1 poetry city in the United States.
Oh, wow.
It used to be New York was it, and Chicago and other places. And now most of the really the poets that are sort of cutting their teeth and really climbing up in the ladder of poetry and performance poetry, especially open mics type of poetry, end up here in DC.
Yeah, no, it's not surprising. And I know nothing that has happened in my career over the past decade plus would have been possible without the spoken word scene here in DC. There is no How the Word is Passed. There is no New York Times bestseller. There is no anything without me going to those venues basically every night of the week, and just like getting in front of strangers, getting in front of people eating their shrimp chorizo pasta, and reading my sad poems. To get back to the book, the origin story of How the Word is Passed is that in 2017, I watched several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans. Statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching those statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And thinking about, well, what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols, but they're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that doesn't mean that if you just take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee, you suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. Or if you change the name of Jefferson Davis Elementary School, you suddenly create more economically and racially egalitarian schools. But it does help us, I think, recognize the ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help ground our understanding of American history and help ground our understanding of the ways that certain communities have been disproportionately and intentionally harmed throughout American history. And so I started looking around New Orleans and trying to figure out, well, what are the places that are telling the story honestly? What are the places that are running from their responsibility to tell the story? And what are the places that are kind of doing something in between? And then I realized that the story was much bigger than New Orleans. New Orleans was the origin point from which this curiosity emanated. But the story, the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape of this country everywhere you turn. And so I went on this journey across the country and ultimately even across the ocean to try to understand how different historical sites, plantations, prisons, memorials, cemeteries, museums, monuments, how all of them tell the story of slavery, or how they fail to tell the story of slavery, and how they kind of do something in between.
You begin the story standing at the edge of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River carries a lot of history. Langston Hughes wrote the poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which talks about how rivers carry stories with them and how they are laden with some horrors and places where civilizations have oftentimes formed around. Tell me about the significance of the Mississippi River. I know for Langston Hughes, it was the place that people were sent downriver. When you were sent downriver, you're basically going to die. When somebody's sent downriver, and he wrote the poem as he was crossing the Mississippi on his way to visit his father, who was in Mexico at the time. Langston Hughes lived in Missouri, and as he crossed the river, he realized how significant that river is and how much history it carries and how much it knows. So tell me about the Mississippi River, especially as it relates to New Orleans, where you were standing.
Yeah, I mean, New Orleans, because of the Mississippi River, was the heart of the domestic slave trade. So the international slave trade was abolished in 1808, which meant that legally, folks were not allowed to bring captured Africans over from West Africa to the United States, even though for many, many decades, people continued to do so illegally. But it was not to the same extent as it was during the sort of government-sanctioned period of time prior to 1808. And what made the United States unique to, say, South America is that the climate of the United States and the sort of nature of the United States made it so that domestic slavery and intergenerational slavery was possible in a way that it wasn't possible in Brazil, for example. So a lot of people don't know that the vast majority of enslaved people, or the vast majority of captured Africans, went not to the United States, they went to Brazil. But the climate of the Brazil, the nature of how they were forced to work, meant that they were dying at much faster rates. They were dying after only a few years of living there as a result of disease, as a result of the way they were treated, as a result of the climate. Whereas here in the United States, people were having children. Obviously, there was still a lot of infant mortality, far more than exists today, but many more children were living into it. People were able to have children. Those children were living into adulthood. There was also a very intentional effort because of that to have enslavers who intentionally, as so many of us know, they were incentivized to have the enslaved women have as many children as possible, because that enhanced their capital. That meant they had more money. That meant they had potentially more workers, potentially more folks they could sell. And so the sort of nature of the domestic slave trade exploded in a way that was unseen kind of anywhere else in the world. And as you alluded to, what slavery looked like, slavery was devastating everywhere. But what slavery looked like in the Upper South was fundamentally different than what it looked like in the Lower South, right? And if you read the slave narratives, you see over and over and over again, folks talking about how devastating the prospect of being sent downriver would be, right? You hear about folks who were enslaved in Maryland, folks who were enslaved in a lot of these border states, talk about how that was the punishment that they were trying to avoid. I just wrote a story about a guy named Josiah Henson, for the Atlantic. And Josiah Henson was a guy who was enslaved here in Maryland, was moved to Kentucky to the enslaver's brother's plantation. And many of his friends and family were sent from Kentucky down to Mississippi. And he talks about how years later he saw them, and the way he talked about how much they had aged, how they were only a few years away from death. I mean, like what the temperature of the Deep South, the expectation of what the sort of the specificity of what working on sugarcane and cotton in the Deep South looked like relative to tobacco or some other things in the Upper South or in the North. It was very different. And so all that's to say, the Mississippi River carries that legacy. It was without the Mississippi River, there is no domestic slave trade as we understand what it is today. Over 100,000 people were sent down the Mississippi River and made New Orleans the centerpiece of the sort of antebellum slave trade after 1808. So, you know, it's interesting for me because the Mississippi River also, it's the sort of juxtaposition of the role that it played in my imagination as a child relative to the history that it carried, which is so consistent with so much of the environment and the iconography of New Orleans, right? And originally How the Word Is Passed wasn't even going to be a book of nonfiction. It was going to be a book of poetry. And I was going to write a bunch of poems about different monuments and different parts of the sort of ecological fabric of the city, and talk about the juxtaposition of my relationship to them as a child and the history that they carry. So what did it mean that my memory of the Robert E. Lee statue was, as a kid, mostly riding bikes past it? What did it mean that my memory of the PGT Beauregard statue was mostly going to the park, you know, City Park, to play with my friends on the playground? What did it mean that my relationship to the Mississippi River is mostly one of, is a deeply sentimental one, right? Like walking along the riverside with my family, eating beignets at Cafe Du Monde right on the other side of the river, knowing that so many of the spaces that I occupied and that so many people move through and navigate today that are predicated on jubilation, predicated on joy. I mean, the French Quarter is the #1 tourist attraction in the United States. It's the thing, or I'd say the United States, but it's one of the most popular things in the United States. It's the most popular tourist destination in New Orleans. And yet the history of that land specifically, like right adjacent to the Mississippi River, runs counter to so much of the jubilation and the joy and the sort of even the debauchery that exists in that space. It was a space that was profoundly devastating. It was a place where families were separated. It was a place where people were held in captivity and unclear what their next destination would be. So I'm always interested in the contrast of the role that something has played historically and how we understand it, or what our personal relationships are to those spaces today, and how they can often be at odds with one another.
So how much did your parents expose you to that history? Did you get a lot of exposure when you were at the Robert E. Lee statue, when you were standing across the Mississippi River, when you were walking by some of those Confederate statues? Did your parents point them out to you, or did they try to sort of shield you from those things?
It's a good question. You know, it was not, we talked about Black history a lot in my family. It was a conversation at the dinner table all the time. You know, I was given so many of those sort of YA and middle grade biographies of like all, you know, the important Black folks you should know in Black American history. But I think that is different than people having the language with which to understand the insidiousness of what the lost cause was. And I don't think that that just wasn't a part of the conversation for most of us in New Orleans. And so I don't have any specific memory of my parents saying that is Robert E. Lee. He was the general of the Confederate. I mean, I think everybody was like, Robert E. Lee, he was the general of the Confederacy. But there was almost, there was something that the sort of intellectual leap from like, he is the general of the Confederacy to the Confederacy is a treasonous territory that raised an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery in perpetuity. like that, we weren't making that connection in the direct way that we are now. We weren't having conversations about the declarations of Confederate secession, where the states said explicitly why the Confederacy seceded. A state like Mississippi in 1861 said, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." And so they're very explicit about why they were seceding from the Union. They weren't vague about it. But those things weren't part of like the landscape of public discourse at that time. In the 80s and the 90s, the way we had conversations about American history was very different, and I think reflected in the way that our political discourse looked. The 90s was rife with conversations around, crack babies and all of this information, all of this pathology about how Black people were responsible for the crime and the poverty and the inequality that existed in our community. I remember being a kid being inundated with that information from political spaces, from the media, and not having the language and not having the toolkit with which to push back against it. And I was like, I know this is wrong, but I don't really know how to say that it's wrong. And I felt a sort of kind of like intellectual and emotional paralysis, where I like knew that what I was hearing was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it was wrong. But then what happens is, especially to a young person, if you inundate them with a certain set of messages all the time, and you don't give them the tools with which to push back against that information, most young people will begin to internalize that information. And I think that happened to me to some extent. So it was a period of confusion. And it wasn't until later in life where I started reading books and seeing films and encountering art that gave me the language, that gave me the information, that gave me the historical context with which to more fully understand, oh, like, this is who Robert E. Lee was. Like, oh, this is who Jefferson Davis was. Oh, this is what the Confederacy was. That you sort of put it together. And I think that was the case for so many of us, right? That's why there wasn't a sort of mass call for these statues to come down until so much of what happened during the Black Lives Matter movement, so much of what happened after Dylann Roof, so much of what happened after George Floyd. The period from 2000, from the death of Trayvon Martin to all the way through George Floyd is a period of time that pushed so many of us it pushed the collective consciousness of this country to think differently about so many of the stories we've been told about the people who were sort of central characters in our understanding of early America, and asked us to reconceptualize or complicate those narratives in really important ways.
The book goes through a set of several monuments and locations that carry that history with them. And it's interesting because and you don't talk about it specifically, but the African American Museum that is now, of course, a monument here in Washington, D.C. I want to hear your impression of the African American Museum and its role. Sometimes I feel like the museum is, of course, it starts out with the first floor and the very bottom, horrific things, slavery and all the slave trade that happened, and so the horrors that go along with that. And then as you rise above, and you end up with, the very top is the accomplishments of African Americans in this country. But I always feel like I think it should have been two museums. The idea of walking in is sort of like being angry and then walking away with a smile on your face feels like a trick. What is your feelings about that?
I think that museum has an almost impossible task. I think to ask a single institution, a single space, to capture the multifacetedness, to capture the complexity, to capture the heterogeneity of the Black experience, I think it would be difficult. I don't know any. I think museums are sort of living, imperfect projects, and the goal of the museum is to try and continue to reflect on ways in which they might be able to tell their stories better, ways in which they might be able to provide space through which people can sit with the complexities, the sort of non-linear narratives, right? Like even part of what you alluded to, this idea that like on the bottom, it starts with slavery and ends with, you know, then we're seeing videos of Barack Obama. And I don't want to misrepresent the museum because the sort of structure of it denotes like a linear set of like, we were enslaved and then we became the president and like, look how great that is. But I think that each exhibit tells a more complicated story that reflects that the journey for Black Americans has not been a simple, easy, linear one. Because we know that's not true. We know that at moments of racial progress, there have always been intense moments of pushback. And we see that happening now. We see, you know, all you have to do is consider the sort of enormous groundswell of discourse that existed after the death and the murder of George Floyd, and how quickly so much of that disappeared, or how quickly so much of that not only disappeared, but transformed into state legislatures across the country attempting to prevent teachers from teaching the very history that explains why our society looks the way that it does today, or from preventing, you know, school boards attempting to prevent librarians from sharing books that provide perspectives that, you know, students that might not otherwise encounter. So I think that the museum does a really effective job. And I think that your point of attempting to contain all of that in a single space is just a really difficult one. I mean, what is true is that we don't have a museum or a memorial or a monument to slavery or the end of slavery in this country, right? And so I think that should be its own museum space, right? Like I don't think that part of what has happened is that the National Museum of African American History and Culture has come to serve as the like de facto slavery museum. And the first floor of it is like, oh, well, like it tells the story of enslavement. But that was, I mean, slavery existed in this country and the British colonies that would have become this country for 250 years. And it's only not existed for a little over 150. So you have an institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't. An institution that is in which there are people alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people who were born into chattel slavery. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a woman named Ruth Bonner, she rang the bell to signal the opening of the museum alongside with the Obama family in 2016. She was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 was the daughter of a man who was born into slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. You know, so when my 6-year-old and my 4-year-old sit on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm just reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't that long ago at all. So I think it is necessary for us to have a museum that is singularly dedicated, singularly focused on exploring and being honest about and wrestling with the totality and the fullness and the insidiousness of what slavery was. And we should have a museum that attempts to hold the expansiveness, the diversity, the multifacetedness of the Black American experience at the same time. I don't think of those things as mutually exclusive. And so I think the museum does a great job. I think it is a difficult job, but I also think that there need to be more places where those stories are being told.
I think it would have been a lot harder to get funding for a museum in the location that it is that just spoke about slavery.
Yeah.
And the experience of that time.
No, I think that's absolutely true.
I wanted to ask you, you know, a lot of times in the book, of course, the book is all about language, all about use of words. And given the current situation we're in Gaza, there's such a division in how people see what's going on the ground. There's a poem here in Above Ground that talks about the New York Times and how they report about wars. So I'd like you to read it, if you don't mind. I think it's very timely of what we're doing, what's happening today. and certainly as it relates to the way language is used oftentimes to change the narrative. If you could say the name of it, please.
The New York Times reports that 200 civilians have just been killed by U.S. military airstrikes. And the man on television calls it unfortunate yet inevitable collateral damage. And I wonder what it is that turns mourning into a metonym or a proclamation of conjecture. And I read his bio, and I see that he has a wife, and I can't imagine he would call it inevitable if her body were pulled from the rubble. And I see that he has a son, and I can't imagine he would call the boy who bears his name collateral in someone else's war. And I see that he has a daughter, and I think of what it might mean for someone to render her final breath in inevitability of realpolitik. And I understand what he means. I know he means that war is callous and unforgiving, that a militant can surround himself with a dozen women and children so that the pilot must decide between a target and the ache of his own heart's detonation. I do not misunderstand the cruelty of war, but I regret the way we talk about its casualties, how their lives become tacit admonitions, how the tyranny of a border made out of thin air means bombs are only dropped on one side of it. But I too have felt empathy corrode inside my most cavernous parts, have taken the quarters from my pocket and used them to cover my collusion. Who among us has not used spare change to cover our contrition, or laid a wreath of sympathy atop bodies with names we do not know? And I'm not sure what it means for us, not to be the ones to fire the bullet, but to behave as if the bullet always belonged in that chest and not our own.
In the book that you have, How the Word is Passed, you talk about, I think, 7 different monuments or areas, and you start with Monticello and the Whitney Plantation, Angola Prison, Blandford Cemetery, Galveston Island, New York City, and Goree Island. Blandford Cemetery in Virginia is a cemetery for the Confederates, right? For Confederate soldiers. And I have a farmhouse in Virginia in a city called Mount Jackson. And you can't go more than a block without seeing a Confederate monument or a cemetery. When we were looking at the place, I remember we went to a coffee shop there, and one of the few coffee shops in that little, very, very tiny town of 2,000 people. And we went in, they had just opened, it was early in the morning on a Saturday, and an elderly woman was fixing coffee. So my wife and I sat at the counter, and the woman was making coffee, and she turned around, very Southern, "Hi, how you all doing?" You know, that kind of thing. And I said, "Can we have coffee?" And she said, "Sure." You know, she was very, very lovely. And I'm looking around the restaurant, and I turn around to one side, and there's a Confederate flag hanging right in front of the window. And so my wife knew what was going to happen next. So she kicked me from the bottom on my foot. And I says, no, we're going to go through this. So the woman turned around, gave us the coffee, and I said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Why do you have that flag hanging there?" And she said, what do you mean? Like, of course I'm going to have a flag there. I said, "It's very offensive. It stands for death and destruction. It is not a good symbol to carry." And she said, "Honey, you misunderstand. It's our culture. It's part of our culture." And I thought, well, you mean a culture of death and destruction? I don't think that's what she meant. But she meant, she sees it in a very different way. And I know that in the Blandford Cemetery, you probably experience the same kind of thing, right? I mean, they see it as part of the culture. Like, you can't hide culture, So tell me about the experience that you had at Blandford Cemetery. And there are some monuments that have done this well and some that have done it really poorly. And Blandford is not at the top of the list of doing it well. Yeah. So can you speak a little bit about Blandford and how that kind of presentation of American history can really be damaging, so to speak?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I didn't begin my project saying that, like, I'm going to go to a Confederate cemetery and spend the day with members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, because I don't think my wife would have let me press send on that. I actually thought I was going to write a chapter on Civil War battlefields. And so I went to Petersburg, Virginia, and I was working on a chapter on like the siege of Petersburg at the end of the Civil War. I thought I was going to write about this national park and the way that they memorialized this really important battle toward the end of the war. And I was there and I was having a conversation with the park ranger. And I was telling him about my book project. And he was like, "Oh, that sounds really interesting. You should go to that Confederate cemetery down the road." And it's almost like when in the movies, when the devil and the angel appear on your shoulder, except it's like in this version, it's like regular Clint and writer Clint. And so writer Clint is like, "We got to go to the Confederate cemetery." And regular Clint is like, "We are absolutely not going to the Confederate cemetery. Like, there's no chance." And one of the reasons I'm very grateful to be a writer is because I think it pushes me to put myself in places that I might not otherwise, I almost certainly would not go on my own. And so for me, I was like, oh, this is where the story is telling me that it needs to go. And so I went to the Blandford Cemetery, which is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where the remains of over 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I went for the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration. So as you can imagine, I was a conspicuous presence at such an event. And it was really fascinating because I remember having a conversation with this guy named Jeff. And Jeff had this long salt and pepper ponytail, this handlebar mustache, this round belly, this biker jacket with Confederate paraphernalia all over it. And he was telling me a story about how when he was a boy, his grandfather used to take him to the cemetery. And they would sit in this beautiful white gazebo at the center of the cemetery. And his grandfather would pull out his banjo and sing the old Dixie anthem on his banjo. And he'd tell them stories about all the men who were buried in this field and how they didn't fight a war for slavery. How secession had nothing to do with slavery, how they were just fighting for their culture. They were fighting for their land. They were fighting for to protect their way of life. It was about states' rights, about state sovereignty. It was about protecting themselves from the war of northern aggression, the war of northern invasion, the Yankees who were trying to take over. And as he's telling his grandson these stories, they're watching the sun set behind the trees. They're watching the sky turn from blue to orange to purple to black, watching the deer come from the trees and graze around the tombstone, watching the fireflies hop from one gravestone to the next, these really sentimental memories. And Jeff told me that now he brings his granddaughters to that same cemetery that his grandfather brought him to. And they sit in the same gazebo where Jeff plays the same songs on the same banjo that his grandfather sang for him. They watch the same sun set behind the same trees that he and his grandfather watched. He tells them the same stories about the men who were buried in these fields that his grandfather told him. And so the thing is, if I were to go to Jeff, be like, "Jeff, I know that your granddad told you that secession had nothing to do with slavery, but all you have to do is look at the declarations of Confederate secession. As I said, like, they laid out very explicitly why they seceded from the Union." For Jeff to accept that information, he would have to accept that his grandfather was lying to him. And if he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him, it threatens to disintegrate the foundation of a relationship he has with a man who has served as a foundational element to him understanding who he is in the world. Right. So, and a man who not only embodies himself, but also who is reflective, who is a microcosm, who embodies an entire community, an entire family, entire lineage of people who has shaped how Jeff understands who he is in the world. And so suddenly, when you ask Jeff to accept a new set of information, even no matter how empirically grounded it is, you're not asking Jeff to just sort of reconceptualize his understanding of American history. You are serving as a catalyst for like an existential crisis. Because who Jeff understands himself to be is deeply tied to the stories he has been told by the people that he loves. And when you tell a different story, when people begin to tell a different story that challenges the sort of prevailing narratives that shape how someone understands who they are in the world, people are very resistant to that, because it means that if you have to tell a different story about a certain person, or if you have to tell a different story about a community, or if you have to tell a different story about the stories you've been told, it means you have to tell a different story about yourself. And that's a very hard thing for a lot of people to do. And I think that was really helpful for me, because it was a reminder that for so many people, History is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told. It's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations, something where loyalty takes precedence over truth. And I think it's important to take seriously the sort of emotional underbelly that undergirds the beliefs that so many of these folks carry, and not to excuse it, not to justify it, but as a way to understand the stakes that exist for them, right? That the vehement pushback, that the feet in the sand, the unwillingness to be moved by all of this evidence that's all around us, by the attempt, in an effort to tell just a fuller, more honest, more complex, more multifaceted story about this country, serves as like a crisis of identity for these people. And I think we have to take that seriously in our sort of analysis of why so many people are committed to holding on to a set of stories, holding on to a set of narratives, despite all of the evidence in front of them that points in a different direction.
So it's holding two things in your head at the same time, right? Yeah. I mean, I think when we're talking about the monument, first of all, what are your feelings about bringing down the monuments? Is that something that you think is necessary, important? What do you think should happen to them? Should they be just crushed or melted, like we've seen some of the statues happen, or should they be moved to a bigger cemetery and have it be another monument?
I think the unsatisfactory answer is that it depends. I think that it depends on what kind of monument you're talking about. You know, I think there are monuments, if we're talking about Confederate monuments, I think that Confederate monuments are kind of the low-hanging fruit of the debate. Like, Confederate monuments feel pretty straightforward to me. These are monuments to people who fought a war that was singularly predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. There is no role for those statues to be erected and maintained by taxpayer dollars in public spaces, in front of courthouses, in traffic circles, in city parks. That runs counter to any notion of justice that I believe in. If you want to have a statue of Robert E. Lee in your backyard, that's weird, but that's your business, right? And so I'm not here to say, I think there's a difference between what is state sanctioned, what is taxpayer funded and maintained, and the decisions that people make about what is on their own property. And so I think that though all statues, all public statues and taxpayer funded statues of Confederates should be taken down. When you begin to have a conversation about people who were not members of the Confederacy, for example, who were presidents of the United States, 12 of our first 18 presidents owned enslaved people.
Thomas Jefferson,
among many others. I think that people of good faith can have very different ideas about what should happen to those statues. I think that part of it is that the decisions, the role that these statues play, and the context in which they were erected often have very hyper-local context, right? And so the role of a James Madison statue in Richmond versus the role, and the context of a James Madison statue in Richmond relative to the context of a James Madison statue in Vicksburg, or the context of a, Andrew Jackson statue in New Orleans relative to the context of an Andrew Jackson statue in Jacksonville. The things that served as the catalyst for their erection in the 19th century and the early 20th century, they're related, but they're very distinct, and they're often based on very local socio-political realities. And so I think that the decisions about whether a statue remains up should also be made on a hyper-local level. The decision about what should be done with those statues should happen on a hyper-local level. So I don't know that there's a sort of blanket, like, all statues of Jefferson should come down, or all statues of Jackson should come down, or all statues of James Monroe should come down. Because there is a distinction that needs to be made between Confederates and US presidents, which is, again, not to excuse the slave owning behavior of people who were also presidents of the United States. But it is also necessary to contextualize it in a different sort of way. You know, I think about how Annette Gordon, I admire so much. She is the sort of foremost scholar on Jefferson and his relationship to slavery. She is the person who is largely responsible for getting Monticello to, with her book, The Hemingses of Monticello, getting them to acknowledge the existence of Sally Hemings, the woman who bore several of Jefferson's children, who was an enslaved woman on his plantation. You know, she is someone who knows more about Jefferson and his relationship to slavery than perhaps anyone in the world. And she was somebody who didn't want a statue of Jefferson that existed in the New York State Assembly or the sort of New York City council chamber, to that she didn't want it to be taken down, right? Because and she's not someone who is acting in bad faith. She's not someone who is interested in maintaining the presence of white supremacy in our public spaces. But I think that she has a different conception of how we understand the totality of who a person was. In this context, the totality of who Jefferson was, in a way that, you know, to her mind, I think she's saying that we must be honest about the role that slavery played in Jefferson's life and how it was a very profound role. But, you know, she's also someone who believes that we should not be overly reductive in reducing Jefferson's entire life to that of slave owner. I know other people, other scholars, other activists who would disagree with that. And so I say all that because I think that there's not an easy answer. For some, I think there is an easy answer. I think what you do with the Robert E. Lee statue is easy, or in terms of taking it down. And then I think there's all sort of creative things you can do, you know, with regard to melting it, which I thought was really fascinating that in the way that they've done down in Virginia. But also some people have put it in museums. Some people have, you know, destroyed it. Some people have. But I think that the most important thing is that these monuments, these pieces of iconography, serve as an entry point for us to have like a much more honest conversation about American history than we've had ever in my lifetime. And I think I've seen much of that, even amid the backlash that so much of educators and folks who are trying to have these conversations are experiencing.
I think you touched on it. Beyond slavery, the idea of white supremacy reigns very big, of course, in the founding of this country. And therefore, I think having, you know, if you look on the monument, you have Washington, you have Lincoln, and you have Jefferson are the major monuments that are sitting there in the middle, which kind of leaves out, you know, a lot of folks that had a lot to do with the founding of this country. Yeah. I mean, that sends a really, you know, a signal, very much like a Robert E. Lee statue sends a signal, even with the kids playing around it and flying a kite next to, you know, Jefferson's monument or Lincoln's monument, whatever. It's still, you know, we internalize that supremacy, and we are subservient to it. So how do you fix that without having to rip them down, let's say? But how do you fix this so that it's not so imposing on our culture, on how we think, how we associate with the rest of the world, how we associate with each other, in a very insidious and subliminal way?
Yeah. I mean, I think that you just have to, one of my sort of fundamental tenets in America, in history and in life, is just sitting with the duality of history, sitting with the duality of our lives, sitting in the uneasiness of contradictions, of both andedness. I mean, you know, to go back to Jefferson, one of the reasons I went to Monticello and made it the first chapter of the book is because that I think Jefferson embodies the cognitive dissonance of this country. America is a place that has provided millions of people and, you know, the ancestors of millions of people with access to upward mobility, and access to social, political, and economic, realities in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. Both of those things are the story of America. It's not just one, it's not just the other. You don't get to pick one to talk about and not talk about the other. It's both of them. And I think that Jefferson embodies that tension in the sense that he is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and is also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. He is someone who wrote one of the most important he wrote in the Notes on the State of Virginia that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. And he wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And, he wrote about Phyllis Wheatley, who's considered to be the foremother of African-American letters, the first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in the history of the United States. He said that her work was below the dignity of criticism, that it wasn't even worth engaging with because he didn't believe that Black people had the necessary intellectual or emotional acumen with which to create beautiful things. He was like, we can call that something else, but we shouldn't call it poetry because Black people don't possess the necessary artistic acumen, intellectual acuity with which to create art.
That's a lot of dissidence to carry.
It's a lot. It's a lot. But I think that, and Jefferson is a microcosm for like so many, prominent founders in this country who knew that Jefferson's interesting. He, in the same way that so many were, like, he knew what he was doing was wrong and wrote extensively about it. You can find letters that Jefferson wrote. He's like, man, like, this is messed up. We should not, in essence, he didn't say it like that, but he was like, this is messed up. We shouldn't be doing this. We will probably pay for this, like, in the afterlife.
And he didn't free slaves after dying.
He freed he had an agreement with Sally Hemings.
Yep.
To free their children when they came of age, which he did, but the rest of them, he did not.
Which were hundreds.
And so after he died, hundreds of families were split apart to pay his debts. He was deeply in debt over the course of his life. And so I think what I'm interested in is, like, how can we ensure that our students, and I'm, deeply committed to this. I was a former high school teacher. And, like, part of what I think about all the time is how can what I wanted for my students, and what I think most educators want for their students, is to be able to present them with the totality of information, and not in a way that is meant to indoctrinate them, not in a way that's meant to say, this is what I believe and this is what you should believe, but in a way that is an attempt to present them with a range of information and a fullness of information that maybe they hadn't encountered before, so that they can make an actual informed decision about how they make sense of American history, about how they make sense of who they are in relationship to this country and in relationship to its history. And I think that both andedness, those contradictions, are embedded in all of our lives because we're human, right? And it's not to equate Jefferson, with the decisions that we make in all of our lives, but part of what is interesting is to think about how, like, we are not immune from our own versions of cognitive dissonance, right? Like, many people, I think about what it means to care deeply about climate change and to also drive an SUV, right? What does it mean to care deeply about labor unions and also to purchase things from companies who attempt to bust unions? And these are, I think, these are things that I think about because I try to hold myself accountable to considering the ways in which I am inconsistent in my own principles. What are the ways in which my actions don't always line up with the values that I espouse? And I think the attempts to name that and reflect on that are attempts to hold myself accountable so that I make better decisions. But I don't operate under any delusion that, like, that my values and my actions line up, in every moment. They don't line up in every moment as a consumer, as a person who participates in capitalism, as a person who is a parent. But I think one of the most important things we can do is to identify the inconsistencies within our lives to try to close those gaps as much as we can.
And you know, with all due respect, Clint, I think there's a big difference between using a water bottle, a plastic bottle, and still believe in climate change, you know, the climate crisis, than holding a bunch of slaves.
100%.
Yeah,
100%. Yeah. No, I don't want to make it sound as if I'm equating the two. I'm not, but I do think, and also to be clear, not to excuse Jefferson by any means, but I think that part of the way that I was taught about our founders is as if they were these sort of like people who were deities, right? Who were flawless, who like I couldn't relate to them at all, or I couldn't, like, they seemed beyond human. And what I'm interested in is studying these people as profoundly human, right? As like profoundly aware of their own inconsistencies, profoundly, you know, and to study the ways that they said one thing and did another, because that is what all of us do, obviously, to various gradations and various degrees of severity. But I do think that there is value in, especially young people, knowing that like these were people. And because they were people, they were far from perfect. And their imperfections often manifested themselves in ways that were horrifically violent and oppressive against other people.
And frankly, evil. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we have to name it for what it is. And sometimes we try to whitewash it. I mean, literally, to try to make us accept the fact that this country is so magnanimous. You know, that that it's that much. You know, that we have to constantly be trying to, you know, twist our thinking to fit the narrative that, you know, the prevailing narrative about this, you know, America the great place. You know, and I mean, I think, you know, Langston Hughes also speaks about the America that is as opposed to the America that could be. And I think sometimes when we hold these people and say, oh, they're just flawed, I think we're selling ourselves short in that allowing that to just pass. I think at some point we have to say, this was evil. I mean, there were people that were fighting to end slavery. It's not like he was in some sort of, you know, fog that he didn't know what he was doing.
Yeah.
He knew what he was doing, and yet he maintained it,
Right.
and maintained it in a very horrific way.
Right.
You know, and this idea of him in love with Sally Hemings is a bunch of crap, as we all know. He raped her. You know, I mean, she was a child. So I think that has to be cleared, and I know it's uncomfortable, and I know it makes us feel like, you know, what kind of foundation are we built on? But I think we have to start over. When the foundation is so rotten, it carries so much across that we can't let go of. Help me understand a little bit better, Clint.
No, I think that's right, and I think part of what I'm trying to get at is that the frailty of of what it means to be human, the fragility, the existence of those flaws is what allows people to participate in evil, because sometimes they're aware of the evil that they're participating in, and sometimes they are able to attempt to convince themselves that what they're doing is actually rational or justified. I mean, you can see that in the shift around the discourse of slavery. You know, in the early days of slavery, it was talked about as a necessary evil by many of the political leaders. I mean, even Jefferson talked about ultimately how he was someone who, in the early days of his political life, was trying to make it so that slavery would be eradicated. Again, as he continued to own his own enslaved property. And then at some point he was like, actually, this is the project of, to paraphrase him, he was like, this is the project of a future generation. You know, our job was to found the country, and slavery exists, and it's a necessary evil in order to sort of maintain our economic independence, to make sure that we are a country that can sustain ourselves economically, but ultimately, like, this is something that we should get rid of. But that's a sentiment that, like, many Virginians, many sort of colonial folks held at the time. They were like, well, as soon as we do this other thing, then, like, we can get rid of slavery, but we need it right now. And then you see that shift, and it moves from slavery being a necessary evil to finding sort of biblical and Christian justifications for the existence of slavery, right? And that entire the discourse, the political and social discourse shifts so that people are looking at slavery and saying, actually, this is as John Calhoun, one of the senator from South Carolina and former vice president of the United States, he said that slavery is a positive good for both black and white people alike. He said that and there were many people who were like, slavery is a civilizing institution. Slavery is an institution that has given black people culture and access to Christianity and access to, again, civilization in ways that they never had. And so people can delude themselves, even as they participate in evil, people can delude themselves into thinking that what they're doing is actually a benefit to those who they are oppressing and enacting violence upon, rather than being what it is an act of violence and an act of evil.
I know you talk a lot about parenting. I want to pivot a little bit. You talk a lot about parenting, and a lot of the book, Above Ground, deals with that and the challenges of parenting, especially young black kids. So I want you to read a poem called Gold Star. It's a beautiful poem about being a father, and I think page 72. And I want us to talk a little bit afterwards about how do we talk to children about this history.
Gold stars. On the days when I am out alone with my children, I'm made to feel as if I am a saint or a god or the undisputed best father of all time. What I mean is that when I walk into CVS and my daughter is wrapped on my chest and my son toddles at my side, people stop and look and gasp and point and walk up to me asking me to shake my hand. Men pat me on the back. Women touch their shoulder and touch their hearts. The manager at the front of the store comes on to the loudspeaker to say, "Excuse me, may I have everyone's attention? On aisle 7, you can get 3 boxes of detergent for the price of 2. And on aisle 5, there is an incredible father running errands alone with his children." Everyone in the store bursts into applause, and someone walks over to hand me a crown and a ribbon and a coupon to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Just the other day, a woman at the park told me how wonderful it is that I took the time to babysit my children. Just the other day, I changed a dirty diaper and someone said, "Praise Jesus." Just the other day, a man on the road stopped his car in the middle of the street, rolled down his window, and told me that I was Father of the Year. It's not that I don't appreciate the sentiment. It's just that this man has no idea what kind of father I actually am. All he saw was me and these 2 children and a diaper bag teeming with crackers. It's not that I don't want people to tell me I'm doing a good job. It's just that I am praised for the sorts of things no one ever thanks my wife for. I am adorned in a garland of gold stars for simply being in this body.
How old are your kids?
6 and 4.
Did you take them to any of the monuments?
Around here?
Yeah, I mean, some of these places that you went to, I know you wrote this book a while ago, they were much younger, but would you take them to any of these monuments? And when would you do that?
So I didn't take them to any of these places. This book came out in 2021. I did most of the research for it between 2017 and 2021. My son was born in 2017. Mostly I left, and then I come home. And it's interesting because, I was writing this book as my kids were both being born and kind of becoming babies and toddlers and young children. And, I would come home from, one of these sites, and I would open the door, and my kid, I'd have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old at home. And so it's not the case that when I open the door after coming home from Angola prison, that my 3-year-old is like, "Dad, you had a really traumatic experience over the last few days. You want some tea? You want to sit down? Like, we should really sit down and process this." No, he was like, get on the ground and be a brachiosaurus, like be a choo-choo train. What are you doing? And I really, my kids were kind of both reminder and respite. They were a reminder of why it was so important to do this work, so that they are growing up in a world in which the story of America is told more honestly than it was told when I was growing up. They were also a respite from the sort of me, I can live in my head. And I think that especially going from, graveyard to prison to plantation to, it was a lot to hold and it was a lot to carry. And I don't know what it would have been like to do this project without my kids being so young that they were able to, that their presence allowed me to sort of step out of it, in a way that I think was very important for me. And that allowed me to come back to the work and come back to the page and come back to my sort of analysis and sort of remembrance of these experiences with fresh eyes, but also with a sense of like, it also just raised the stakes for me. Like, because when I'm with my kids, when I'm with my 3-year-old, my 1-year-old, now my 6-year-old, my 4-year-old, I look at them and I think about me walking into a slave cabin at the Whitney Plantation. And I just imagine my children in that sort of context. I consider that, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, that like my children could have been born in a different time, in a different place, in a different era, in which they were born enslaved. I mean, again, like my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. My children know a man whose grandfather was born into chattel slavery. And I think, in a different context, it's the same thing with what's happening in Gaza. I mean, it is impossible for me to look at what is happening in Gaza and to not see my own children in these kids, right? To not consider that, like, again, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, that could have very easily been my kids, that could very easily be my kids, subjected to the terror and violence that these kids are being subjected to right now. And I think that that's one of the things that parenthood has done for me, is that it has expanded my capacity for empathy. Because the love I feel for my children is something that I've never experienced in any other context in my life. I mean, it's very distinct from the love you experience for your partner, your spouse. It's like its own sort of thing. And so for me, it is just a reminder, whether I'm looking historically and considering the experiences of enslaved mothers who were separated from their kids, whether I'm looking across the ocean and at, mothers and fathers in Gaza who are like looking for their children under rubble. For me, it just is a reminder that these are not historical abstractions. These are not political abstractions. These are, as I talk about in that poem, this is not simply collateral damage. These are people. These are kids. And it is, I would have written a very different book if I didn't have children, because I don't think I would have understood like the emotional stakes at play. I wouldn't have like stood in these sites, stood in the places where people were separated and sold on the auction block, and considered what it would feel like for me to be separated from my kids and to not know if I would ever see them again. It's like, it's an unfathomable thing to consider. And yet you then realize that, oh, this was the reality for millions and millions and millions of people for centuries. And it just makes it so much more real, so much more tactile. And it just makes it clear about why it is so important that we do work that illuminates how horrific it was, that illuminates the horrors of of slavery and indigenous genocide and all of these other historical traumas, and that also similarly that illuminate so many of the political traumas that we see happening now, so that people understand why, just understand what's at stake.
When do you start talking to your kids about this? When do you plan, you, Clint, plan to talk to your kids about all of this that you experienced?
Yeah. I mean, we talk about it now. We talk about, I don't think it's something you wait for. I mean, I don't want to just suddenly start talking about racism and colonialism, with my kids when they turn 13, because they will have already had an entire, decade plus of looking at the world and forming opinions or judgments, or look, and if I'm not giving them the tools, again, we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning. If I'm not giving my kids the tools with which to understand the sort of structural and systemic realities that shape how certain people live in different places, then what my kids are going to do is what any human would do, is they're going to look around and be like, oh, the reason that group of people live that way and that group of people over there live that way must have something to do with those people, and not be because of things that were extracted from those people, resources that were taken from those people, the ways that those people were systemically prevented from having access to the levers of upward mobility. And so what you do is you do it in a developmentally appropriate way. You do it in a way that's scaffolded. You do it in a way that is not going to traumatize your child, but you also do it in a way that helps your child understand, that gives them a framework with which to begin to understand. So my kids have gone to the Black History, the African American Museum of History and Culture. My kids have been to the MLK Memorial. My kids have been to the Harriet Tubman Museum. We were driving to Ocean City. I wasn't even aware that it was out there, but we were driving to Ocean City this past summer, and we passed the Harriet Tubman Museum, and so we pulled over and stopped there. And the thing is, a lot of these museums also want to serve kids well, right? And so there's all sorts of like interactive things, or all sorts of spaces that are specifically oriented toward young people, toward children. And so I want my kids, their ancestry from my side is, they are the descendants of enslaved people. Their ancestry from their mother's side is Nigerian. And so, we are having conversations about colonialism. We're having conversations about slavery. We're having conversations about segregation. And so I want my kids to understand those things. And at the same time, I want my kids to understand that their history is not singularly defined by violence, by oppression, that their lives and their history and the possibilities for them are far more expansive than that. And that they should not feel sort of anchored by or tied down by a history of violence, but should only feel limited by the limits of their imagination, right? And so, practically, in their little libraries, in their rooms, and in our house, like we have the kids' books about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and Coretta Scott King, and and we also have the kids' books about the little black boy who wants to grow up and be a scientist, and the little black girl who wants to grow up and be an engineer, and the little black kid who wants to grow up and be a robot, and the little black kid who wants to grow up and be a bottle of ketchup, right? Like, and I think that again, to go back to that both-andedness, right? It's not just one or the other. It's not like, well, your history is only this, or your life is only this, or being black in America is only this. It's all of it, right? It is taking seriously the history, and it is recognizing that generations of people struggled so that your life could look like what it does today. And so what responsibilities do you have in order to live your life in a way that attempts to build the sort of world that you might not see yourself, but that somebody someday will, because that's what was done for you. And I think that that's the beautiful thing about the sort of Black tradition, is that we are living my life and my children's life are only possible because of generations of people who fought for a world they knew they might never see, but they fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And so that is the ethos that I try to raise my children with, often imperfectly. And sometimes I'm just like, take your Cheerios and get in the car. But, you know, I try, my wife and I, we try to be very intentional about having our kids understand the history of this country as it relates to them in ways that maybe give them language and understanding that we didn't necessarily have at the time.
Do you worry about their safety?
I think it's impossible to have a Black child and not worry about their safety. And I think about safety, like I think about their emotional safety, their physical safety, their sort of psychological safety. You know, so no place, I think the last several years have shown us that, you know, regardless of if you're in a city or a suburb or wherever, the adultification of Black children, the way that Black children are often rendered to be older, more dangerous than they actually are, is omnipresent. So I think, you know, I carry the same fears that my parents carried for me and that my grandparents carried for my parents. I think what you try to do is to, again, just give your children the tools with which to understand who they are as it relates to their community. You know, we live in Silver Spring. My kids go to like a wonderful, diverse public school, kids from like 50 different countries, huge immigrant population, a lot of Black and brown kids. But I also know that like right now, you know, again, 6 and 4, they are still largely seen as like cute kids. I also know that that will end for them much earlier than it will for many of their counterparts. I remember my parents having that conversation with me and how hard that was for me to hear and understand, because I was like, why are you telling me to do something that I see Charlie and David and Johnny do every day? You know, why, you know, I have a poem that I wrote, I mean, over a decade ago now, that I used in a TED Talk that I had in 2015 about the conversation that my parents had with me. That's in there, isn't it? I don't know, that one's not in here. But a poem, you know, poems that are adjacent to it are, there's a poem, My National Anthem, that's in here that I think talks a little bit about this. And I can read that, but just considering like what is taken away from children because they are forced to consider how they move their bodies or how they speak in ways that are far more existential than maybe their white friends and counterparts would ever have to consider. Here's a poem that is thinking a little bit about this, that's adjacent to it, called Your National Anthem. Today, a Black man who was once a Black boy like you got down on one of his knees and laid his helmet on the grass as this country sang its ode to a promise it never kept. And the woman in the grocery store line in front of us is on the phone, and she is telling someone on the other line that this Black man who was once a Black boy like you should be grateful we live in a country where people aren't killed for things like this. You know, she says, in some places they would hang you for such a blatant act of disrespect. Maybe he should go there instead of here so he can appreciate what he has. Then she turns around and sees you sitting in the grocery store cart surrounded by lettuce and yogurt and frozen chicken thighs. And you smile at her with your toothless gum smile. And she says that you are the cutest baby she has ever seen and tells me how I must feel so lucky to have such a beautiful baby boy. And I thank her for her kind words, even though I know I should not thank her, because you will not always be a Black boy, but one day you may be a Black man, and you may decide your country hasn't kept its promise to you either. And this woman, or another like her, will forget you were ever this boy, and they will make you into something else and tell you to be grateful for what you've been given.
Thank you very much, Clint Smith. It's a pleasure to have you here. Next up to the mic at Busboys of Poets. We really appreciated you.
Thank you.
So we have a few more minutes, if you don't mind signing some books before you go. And we have your dinner ready to take home. All right. Thank you.